Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, coming to you with the January 15, 2019 episode of Mind Your Banners and Chronic today, and this is what I wrote last night, but I feel like talking about it again today, and I'm the host, so damn it, we're going to do it. Today I just keep thinking about Fear Factor and what Indiana's lost. And
I was thinking about Double Dare. I like that a whole lot more than Fear Factor.
I already regret this podcast. It's fair. In fairness, I've regretted this podcast since we started doing it. When we sit where we sit on press row, we sit next to the opposing radio.
Yeah.
Most of the time, and the Nebraska radio guy, I forget his name off the top of my head. I'll Google it while we're doing this. But he is a gentleman who is a little bit older. I think his name's Kent Pavelka. Kent Pavelka, that's his name. He's a little bit older, probably, I'm guessing, somewhere in his 60s, and very enthusiastic. One might say at times a little bit too enthusiastic, but you know, he's in-house. It's his job, and he spent a lot of last night calling the game. I guess you'd describe it as breathlessly. You know, in terms of just the excitement of what was happening and what was going on, and looking at, you know, talking about the start Nebraska got off to, the way Glenn Watson played, the way they kind of closed the game out in the second half, obviously. And I kind of thought, I kept listening to him, and I just kind of thought, you know, this is going to be a good win for Nebraska, for a team that needed road wins last year and couldn't get them in the Big Ten. But, like, Indiana's the number 25 team in the country. You know, this is a fairly middle of the road NCAA tournament team right now. And let's be really clear, it's regardless of what the Chicken Littles on Twitter are saying, this is still an NCAA tournament team today. But it felt like he was watching Nebraska beat an Indiana that maybe exists in the memory of some people, that has not been a reality very consistently for a long time now. And it just struck me that there was a fear factor attached to Indiana for a very long time. When you played Indiana, it was like playing Duke. It was like playing Kansas. It was like playing Kentucky. Like you were down 5 points before tip-off just on your concern for the brand across the floor from you. And it's not really necessarily Archie's fault, any of these players' fault. It's not even really, I wouldn't necessarily say Tom Crean's fault. If anything, I think Tom Crean came closer to getting it back than anybody has in a long, long time. But it's been lost. And if Indiana's going to be what Indiana wants to be, it needs to come back. It needs to be regained.
No, I think that's perfectly fair. I think it's kind of ironic that, as you described that scene last night, you know, in the period since Nebraska joined the Big Ten,
6-4 against Indiana since they joined the conference.
Yeah. For, you know, what most observers felt like was going to be basically a gimme game for most conference rivals. We now live in a world where Nebraska basketball can regularly beat Indiana, and Nebraska football is beatable by almost anybody in the conference. And what a time to be alive, man! No, I can imagine he was breathless. The folks in my section, my 9-year-old included, were rather breathless as well. But you know, coming on the complete opposite end of the spectrum last night, there were audible gasps just 2 minutes into the game. I mean, the Hoosiers found themselves in a 7-0 hole, and as problematic as that is, as frustrating as that is, as familiar as that is, I think what was most troubling from my seat, at least in Assembly Hall, was how willingly they seemed to accept it. There was a very palpable sense of just indifference almost to start the game. Like, they've done this before. This is how we always do it. And as we've said, you know, ad nauseum up until this point, they were able to get away with it quite a bit in December.
It was more the way it snowballed for me, that it felt like every mistake was compounding on the last one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it was transferring from one end of the floor to the other. You know, a bad pass, turnover, missed basket, resulting in just an even more lethargic defensive stand. I think it's been made pretty clear that in this league, most teams, how they're going to attack Indiana Obviously, Juwan's propensity for drawing early fouls is inviting teams to attack him from the onset. And then once the defense, as we've seen now, Arch is going to be more inclined to give help side, to double down when Juwan gets pinned on the low blocks. It's opening up the 3-point shot.
They don't really have enough to defend. I mean, the other reason they can attack Juwan Morgan is they know how thin Indiana is behind Juwan Morgan.
No, absolutely. And understanding that he's so far been inclined to get himself in some bad situations early on, and it really puts the Hoosiers against the ropes before they've ever even had a chance to make it to the first media timeout. So, the plan of attack is obvious. What is a little less obvious now is how they're going to respond to that, how they're going to adjust to it. And what we've seen so far, I mean, coming off, we'll call it tough loss at Michigan, a very winnable game against Maryland, but also recognizing the schedule ahead of them. I think I described before we started rolling this, just a complete lack of situational awareness where they are on the schedule right now and just what the stakes of last night's game were. Probably perhaps more than anything, that was the most disappointing element of the game, is just their complete inability to respond to the moment. At a time in the season, though, where last year we saw Archie's team really starting to dig in and stake an identity, right now they seem like a rudderless ship when it comes to really asserting themselves and trying to play to some level of identity.
Do you think it's a lack of situational awareness or a lack of capacity to address their situation? Because I don't really think it's lost on these guys, like, what's at stake. I think that if this team lacked situational awareness, they wouldn't have gone 6-0 in December and won 4 straight games by a single possession over teams that, you're dealing with teams that suddenly at varying levels of kind of the NCAA tournament conversation. Penn State, Northwestern probably out, Butler firmly on the bubble, Louisville may be in at this point. But one way or the other, if this was a team that didn't have that situational awareness, I don't think that they start the way that they do. I don't think they come out of non-conference the way that they do. I guess my question is more, is this a team that maybe suddenly doesn't have the capacity to meet those situations, whether it's because of injuries or because of depth or because of some I don't want to say leadership issues, but maybe not enough guys beyond Juwan Morgan being able to really kind of command a huddle, command a room, command a court, whatever. Do you understand what I'm kind of getting at here?
I do.
I'm not sure the want to isn't there. I think it's more maybe the lack of appreciation for how to execute that, especially when you're talking about everything from just a personnel perspective that this team has had to deal with this season.
Well, I can see there are a lot of fair points you just made there. What I cannot accept under any circumstance, not particularly when you're in an early hole at home on a 2-game losing streak, is loafing your way back on defense. That is never going to be acceptable on any team. But when you're wearing that jersey in that gym, in that moment, that cannot happen. It just can't happen when you've done this so repeatedly here as of late. You cannot allow yourself to become complacent on the defensive end, knowing that this is not a particularly good shooting team. This is actually a pretty bad shooting team on par right now. They're not going to be able to gun their way back into most of these games. They're going to have to grind it out. And we've seen them do that repeatedly now after they've gotten themselves into a tough spot. I think what's the most frustrating, at least from my perspective, is to watch them so willingly find themselves back in the same spot that they have to dig out of. Like, if you're tired of having to dig out of a hole, stop digging to begin with.
Well, and I think that's where maybe your point about the directions of seasons last season versus this season is probably fair. I guess the one flip side is last season you've got 5 seniors in Juwan Morgan. And so there's a lot. And really you don't have the same injury issues, obviously. But you've got 5 seniors, and including, a guy like Rob Johnson, who's a 4-year starter, guys like Freddie McSwain and Colin Hartman, who may not be big role play, may not have big roles, but
healthy McRoberts
are still going to. A healthy Zach McRoberts is a big one. It's just, again, and it's not exactly apples to apples comparing last season to this season, but I do think that's a fair point, and that's maybe a little bit of why is why it's going in this direction as opposed to
Well, and just look where this team was 2 months ago. I mean, we were talking about a team that had an abundant supply of length, speed, and depth. And those are probably three adjectives that would be the furthest from those I would choose from in describing the current composition of this roster right now. Where there may still be some speed available, they don't seem to be leveraging it, if at all. The length has been negated by injuries, taking certain guys out of the rotation, and obviously that's affected the depth for a team that seemed like it had endless supply of wings. Right now, when Juwan sits, they don't have a lot of answers.
A lot of their wings are, two of their wings are sort of permanently in street clothes. We heard last night that Jerome Hunter is the plan now is for him to redshirt. I think we'd all kind of presumed that. It sort of had been one of those things that had quietly made its way around, but no one confirmed it. Now we know it. Race Thompson is still out.
Let me ask you a sidebar on Race. Do you think the fact that they've addressed Jerome's redshirt situation now, obviously he's post-surgery, so there's usually a medically imposed timetable, at least subsequent to examination following in the rehab process. Do you think it's more likely that we see Race this year, or less likely? Do you find it odd that
Race Thompson doesn't have a red shirt? What he would apply for would be a sixth year.
Right,
this is
right.
No. It's not a hardship. This is an important distinction that people have. A
Enlighten
medical
us.
red shirt is something that you get if you have not used your red shirt. If you play,
Gotcha.
have a red shirt year available. You play. It has to happen in the first half of the season. What is it? No more than I think 30% of your games, whatever that comes out to competition wise. And if you get hurt, you can apply and get that year back via what's called a medical red shirt. What Race Thompson would have to apply for, and I don't know the particulars, I would imagine he's an ideal candidate for it, is a waiver for a sixth year of eligibility, which he would not apply for, per my understanding, until after his fifth year of college.
Gotcha.
So it's the distinction is important because it's not something anybody is going to be worrying about right now. So I don't know if we're going to see Race Thompson again this season or not. I mean, signs would point to no, just based on timelines and the suggestion that we still haven't heard that he's back to basketball activity or anything like that. And you start to get to a point where it's as much about conditioning as it is about anything else. But one thing, what's worth pointing out is that Race Thompson is not gunning for a medical red shirt. He's looking for a sixth year of eligibility. Now, I actually, what would be an interesting question to ask if we have any NCAA rules experts out there, because I'm not sure on this. You can't get a medical red shirt if you play in the second half of a season. The idea being you can't hold somebody out, then bring them in at the very end, and then claim
another year.
Right, exactly. I don't know if that applies for a sixth year. So from Race Thompson's perspective, he plays basically one game. It's Montana State. I think he played 4 minutes, and then he's back out again. I don't know if he could come back on March 1st, if that would somehow preclude him from getting the sixth year, or if they would still look at the sixth year in terms of the totality of time that he has missed, if that makes sense. But one way or the other, it's just worth saying this because I've gotten a lot of this of, is he going to get a medical red shirt, whatever. That's not what he would be looking for. He would be looking for
the Brian Cardinal plan.
Yeah, I mean, the last person, was his name Josh Hager? He was an offensive tackle. He played Wilson's first year. And I think he was a guy who took a sixth year and then I think injured his knee again. But so anyway, that was
great.
Not to cut across you, but that's one of those things that has kept coming up, and I think it's an important distinction. Race Thompson is not going to be a redshirt freshman again next season. Presuming he gets back to full health and whatever, he'll be a redshirt sophomore. And then what they'll look for, if he wants it at the end of his career, is a sixth year.
Fair enough. And the only reason I want to bring that up is one, it's been one of the things that's been unaddressed thus far. And for those that are still unaware, he's dealing with some concussion-related symptoms from earlier this season. But it certainly threads into a larger narrative with this team, as I can't remember ever a team that's dealt with this many injuries in one season. Just a couple months into
this
it.
Many unrelated injuries. It's not like it's all soft tissue stuff, and so then you can ask questions about was conditioning, things. I mean, it's 2 concussions, it's a back problem,
Let's run it down. So you got concussions in Finney, Ray
it's a
Thompson.
weird
You've got an underlying
sort of-
foot issue with Jerome Hunter.
Yeah, something in his lower body, leg, foot, but like something that doesn't seem to really be related to practice. Like that's what Archie Miller said. It's not like a wear and tear thing. Devontae Green had a thigh contusion. Deron Davis is one where you just sort of feel like he's never had the opportunity to get fully healthy, but the ankle is basically he got stepped on or rolled up on in the Illinois game. Al Durham is taken just contact issues at different points. I mean, it really is just like I said, it's unrelated injuries that seem to be getting this team as much as anything else.
No, it's just the snowballing effect of them, and it's not just the number of players that are out. It's the way in which it's impacted their ability to really kind of cohese and form some semblance of a functioning unit from spot to spot, front court to back court. You get the sense still, here we are in the Ides of January, and we've yet to get a great look at what this team could be if it had all of its pieces available at one time, not to mention if they'd had some time to gel together. And, it still seems early at the end of the day, though. It still seems very late as far as their hopes for ever achieving those potentials. And it's not going to get any easier. Four of the next 5 on the road. You got trips to the probably the most hostile environment the Hoosiers will face all year here this Saturday at Mackey Arena. That lovely 2 p.m. tip that you enjoy too much for any reasonable person. New Welsh Ryan. Renovated, which normally is not as hostile to IU. It's usually about half IU fans, half Northwestern. But they still got to go to Breslin. They still got to go to Chrysler, trip out to Piscataway. This is a tough stretch for Indiana right now, and I think that's when I was talking about the situational awareness earlier. I think everybody knows as a general rule in the league, on any given year, you have to protect your home court. And you've got to steal them on the road when you can. So to go back-to-back games where you probably let one go at Maryland in what was otherwise a very winnable game, and then come home and lay an egg, it's a really, really bad way to get going in this post-Michigan stretch of early Big Ten play.
No, I don't doubt that, and this is a team that's got to find a way to bank home wins. I mean, that's what's got to be reliable, especially while you're dealing with depth concerns, and especially as you say, you're going through a stretch here where it's 6 of 8 on the road. The home games are difficult. I mean, Nebraska, if they'd won last night, it would have been their best win of the season. Nebraska's 11th in KenPom right now. Your next home game is against Michigan, so it doesn't get. I mean, Michigan may be number 1 when they come into Assembly Hall for that game.
We all remember how the last one of those went.
That's true. And I think that what strikes me when you talk about depth, this is another thing that's come up to me a lot, and I just want to get your thoughts on it, was questions about, I guess what you call more fringe players, DeMazie Anderson, Jake Forrester, until maybe recently Clifton Moore. Why aren't they playing more? And my argument, my contention is that since both when you look at his time at Dayton and since day one at Indiana, Archie Miller has preached roster balance. He's preached class balance, and it's been pretty clear he's a guy that wants some. He's not averse to having your Romeo Langfords and so forth, but he wants system players as well. He wants guys that are going to be 3rd, 4th, 5th, even 5th-year players. He hasn't been afraid to redshirt before. He redshirted at Dayton. He's redshirted at Indiana already. And when I look at a player like Jake Forrester, I see a lot of potential. I see a lot of tools and just sort of, promising. Well, let's just say promise. Let's just call it promise. But I also wonder if you're in a candid conversation with Archie Miller, if he says, listen, Jake Forrester could absolutely play right now, but I'm not sure he's ready. And if I play him when he's not ready, there's every chance he starts developing bad habits. And then too much of the developmental arc of his career becomes me trying to coach and my staff having to sort of coach those bad habits out of him. And I think we've seen that happen with freshmen in the not so distant past. And I'm genuinely not here to criticize Tom Crean. I think Brian Tonsoni, our friend from Delphi Brackets, made a really good point on Twitter when he said that it's not really a criticism of either coach to say that a Tom Crean player and an Archie Miller player aren't really that similar in a lot of different respects. And so right now what you've got is a coach trying to take a program and a roster from one clear-cut sort of emphasis and way of playing to another. And that's not a reflection poorly on Tom or Archie. It's just that things have changed. But within the framework of that, what I would argue is that it's smarter to be careful with a Jake Forrester or a DeMazy. And if in 2 or 3 years they haven't worked out, then you can hold Archie Miller accountable for that. But I guess my point is, just because you got a guy doesn't mean you need to play him. And sometimes actually maybe it means you shouldn't play him.
No, and I think that's perfectly fair. I think in addition to that, I even take it a step further. I would say you've probably got a number of players in the regular rotation right now who, under ideal or perhaps a little more normal circumstances, wouldn't be as active in the rotation as what they currently are. You've got a lot of guys who are basically being asked to play ahead of their natural cycle in what would otherwise be a normal roster rotation as guys progress up the classes. Because usually you're not going to see a lot of freshmen come in and get this many minutes. You're not going to be this dependent on this many sophomores who were thrust into the fire early on as freshmen. Part of it is the next man up philosophy. Part of it is just the incongruencies of the way in which the rosters were built. I don't know that you see Devontae Green and Al Durham in an Archie Miller roster 3 years down the road. I just don't know that those are the types of guards that he goes out and gets.
And that's not a criticism.
It's not
a criticism of those players. It's not a criticism of Tom Crean. It's not a criticism of Archie Miller. It's just that when you make a hire like Archie Miller, you can't be thinking, how does he fit our current roster? You have to be thinking, what kind of roster will he build given time? And there's going to be some natural conflict when you have a coach who was as expansive and free-flowing and offensive as Tom could be, and you transition to a coach whose mindset, whose emphasis, whose whole sort of, ethos is built around tough-minded defense first. There's just going to be some growing pains.
No, and when you look at this roster, how many players would you, as if you had to choose 2 adjectives, how many of these players on this current roster would you pin as tough? I mean, maybe Jawan. These guys have a lot more finesse. It was more that all gas, no brakes that Tom loved to play. It just right now I think we're seeing a lot of growing pains. I think we're seeing a lot of issues that are resultant from that. And again, this is not playing the blame. We've reached that point of unbearable IU fan Twitter where, everything gets divided into 2 camps and you're either a hater or you're a blind supporter and everything else. And the nuance, the gray area in between just gets lost. And I understand how that happens. And Lord knows I'm one to maybe flame out a little bit after losses like last night. But at the end of the day, though, here's the thing, man. It is what it is. This is the hand that Archie has been dealt. They're going to have to figure it out. And they're going to have to figure it out really, really quick because, again, it's not getting any easier. There's not, I don't expect to see DeMazy all of a sudden just inserted into the lineup and providing meaningful contributions unless there just comes a point where we recognize that Zach McRoberts can no longer walk. I mean, watching him get up off the bench last night, I do better at 12 o'clock on a Saturday morning, midnight Friday night after I've worked 65 hours and had a couple of pints than he does getting off the bench last night. I mean, he just looks broken. Deron Davis just looked in pain to move. There's nobody else left at this point. I was a little surprised that Cliff Moore didn't get more minutes in the second half. I saw everybody had commented on it. I felt like we were witnessing what was the onset of the Cliff Moore coming out party. And just as quickly as our hopes got up for that, Archie seemed to throw a little bit of cold water on it for whatever reason. But, end of the day, though, here's the thing, man. I was 16 points from Hoosiers not named Juwan or Romeo. The backcourt not named Romeo went 2 for 10 from the floor, 1 for 5 from the free throw line, combining for 6 points, 4 assists, 4 turnovers in 82 minutes. Front court players not named Jawan went 4 for 12 from the floor, 2 for 5 from the line, combining for 10.6 boards, 4 TOs in 49 minutes. At the end of the day, there has got to be something more substantive around those two players.
More what?
Substantive.
That's not a word.
Yes, it is.
Substantive.
I don't want to hear your...
I'm just...
Listen, grammar police. Hamburglers. I brought 1,000 hamburgers. I don't even know. I've devolved quickly.
Yeah, this has gotten... I mean, look, I know what you're saying. I think
there's got to be something else. Guys have to step up in some way.
But,
how?
What if they don't? What if they can't? I mean...
We're seeing what happens.
You think it might be Devontae Green, but he follows a great performance with 2 or 3 really inconsistent ones. You've seen some promise from Deron Davis, but he's not healthy. You've seen some promise from Al Durham, but he's not healthy. Justin Smith's defense and rebounding games have both progressed considerably in the last year. His offense just hasn't followed suit. And then I think you can also fall into this sort of catch-22 where you become over-reliant on a Romeo Langford or a Juwan Morgan, and then as more and more things don't work, you almost become over-reliant. And it becomes too much of a security blanket that guys are afraid, to step into a 3 when they should. Guys are afraid to attack the basket when they should. All of a sudden, it just kind of becomes this bailout of things aren't going wrong. Somebody just put the ball in Juwan's hands. But to your point, teams more and more can key on Juwan because they know that Indiana doesn't have other options around the post because Indiana's not going to knock down a ton of threes. I've also heard people say, well, a lot of these were problems last year. Well, last year Indiana wasn't gunning for an NCAA tournament berth. That's the difference. Last year expectations were much lower. If this is Indiana's record last season, then Indiana, and then everybody I think is broadly speaking, they're frustrated with a 3-game losing streak, but they're broadly speaking excited about the direction of the program. It's the changing sort of nature of expectations in year 2, expectations when you have a senior in Juwan Morgan, a freshman like Romeo Langford, but then also not really knowing exactly where to pin your expectations when arguably your third best player has been out the entire season, when your best point guard just missed 3 weeks with a concussion, when some guys probably just haven't taken the steps that you hoped that they would offensively.
Al Durham low-key keeps taking in-game knocks that would effectively knock him out for the remainder of the game.
Yeah, even if he's playing at this point, you have to imagine he's not playing at full strength.
Yeah.
And how many of these guys – and look, I know everybody's got knocks and everybody's got bangs and things like that, but it's like Indiana's got guys playing banged up and then also multiple long-term injury absences. So it's Indiana's getting, punched from both directions, basically, in that regard.
Yeah, unquestionably. I think that's objectively fair. And at the end of the day, too, it's also it's probably not changing anytime particularly soon. And I guess, at least personally for me, you look at some of the frustrations and the opportunities that were apparent early on that seem to be vanishing before our eyes. When you've got a generational talent, you've got a historically valuable contributor in Juwan Morgan. He's going to go down as one of the better Hoosiers ever to lace him up for Indiana, and to see just how close they could have been, yet how far away it remains at the same time due to these circumstances. Now, tremendous opportunity this weekend to respond. Because again, I do think it's important to keep in context just exactly where this team is in the season. Certainly the hyperbole that Twitter is great for, exaggerating, magnifying. A lot of folks feeling like all hope is lost at this point. I guess it's really a way in how they approach this matchup against the Boilermakers, because
I want to stop you there. Something you said is something that I wanted to throw into this podcast that has been fermenting in my mind for a long time. It was something I said I wasn't going to talk to you about before we started because I just wanted to hit you with it. You said all hope is lost. And I know you don't mean that you've lost all hope. But this is something that's probably it's certainly something that has really kind of taken on coherence in my own mind since watching the Night documentary, which I will admit up front I did not expect to be maybe as eye-opening as it was. I sort of just expected it to be a retelling of a lot of old stories I'd already heard. But it was interesting to see. It was well done because it was just kind of putting all of that in one place in a really sort of zoomed in, focused way. And it's this sort of thought, and I probably should write something on this, but this broader thought is one that where I've obviously reached back into my own kind of history of being around this program for like at least the last 20 years. This has been a crisis fan base. It has been a fan base that has just moved from one crisis to the next, to the next, to the next. I mean, if it didn't start, at best it started with Neil Reed and everything that happened around Neil Reed. And then Bob Knight was fired. And then a burst of sunshine kind of got let in when they got to the Final Four in 2002. Then Mike Davis's struggles bubbled up all sorts of animosities around the fan base. There was the roller coaster ride that was Kelvin Sampson's tenure, which obviously ended in a massive bottoming out. If anything, the Tom Crean era was the most normal thing Indiana had in a really long time. The crises were much more sort of, at least on the beaten path or near the beaten path, rebuilding the program, getting it back again. Tom got it closer to that Fear Factor level in 2011 and 12, 13, that kind of era than anybody had in a long, long time. But then there was a precipitous drop after 2013. Then there was a really kind of uneven sort of expectation versus results. 17 wins, 20 wins, 27 wins, 17 wins. Just
it wobbled.
It was just so up and down, so inconsistent. While at the same time, you had all sorts for about a year and a half there of off the court issues. Players getting cited for different violations. The obviously unfortunate Devin Davis incident that I don't want to blow out of proportion, but you take it in the context of everything else that happened, and it just. Even that felt like a program constantly teetering on the brink of crisis. And my point is, losing to Nebraska is not a crisis. Losing 3 games in a row in the Big Ten is not a crisis. It's cause for concern. It raises questions about the direction of this season. It is a challenge that can, reveal the best or worst of the capacity of this coach, his staff, and his roster, his players, to respond to adversity. But, not every win, and certainly not every loss, and I think this happens after wins as well as losses, but definitely losses, can be a referendum on the head coach, the roster, the direction of the program. If, it can't mean that much. That is not healthy. And it's not really any one person's fault other than, maybe you could argue some administrative decisions down the years surrounding the latter Knight years, the Sampson hiring, things like that. Certainly from that perspective, you could assign some blame to individual people, but in the broader, in the sort of broad brush sense, it's not anybody's fault. But nevertheless, this fan base, I find myself saying a lot that I'm not an IU fan, and I think it's just the minor paranoia that comes from attending IU, having spent so much of my career covering IU, and therefore feeling very sort of self-conscious about not wanting to. It's very easy to start connecting those dots, especially if you're trying to. But I genuinely look at this from a position of objectivity, and I've been around this program, not as long as some, but since 2005, so I've been around for a while. And this fan base has got to, however it can, and I don't know what the solution is, but get to a place where one loss or even one string of losses is bad and is cause for concern and questions and debate, but is not reason to lose all hope, because that's not a crisis. Archie Miller hitting a downturn in form in January of year 2, when everybody, broadly speaking, still agreed that even though he got Romeo Langford and had Juwan Morgan, this was still a roster in transition. This was still a program that was young. This was still a team that had a lot of issues to work through, and then all of a sudden got smacked with a ton of injury problems. It's not a crisis.
No, and I think you make a lot of valid points there. On the macro sense, this is a program that ever since, and even honestly since the mid-'90s, the latter part of the '90s, when you look at the course, they have tacked very wildly and hard from one side to the other. There has not been much of a constant that's guided their path. They have swung from many extremes and back. On the micro, I think you look at a team, and maybe even step back a little further. You look at a program that is yet again in a situation where they kind of have to self-assess. And I think for Indiana fans, that's oftentimes been hard post-night, understanding where they are in this new era of college basketball, understanding where they are in this current version of Indiana University basketball, understanding what got them there, I guess is the best way to put it, to appreciate who you are at this moment and what you aspire to be. And I think in a lot of ways, the Romeo commitment and matriculation to the university certainly gave folks a lot of hope, a lot of reason to be excited about the future of the program. It's important, I think, to step back and recognize that last night I took my 9-year-old into a gym that was, although late arriving, still really full.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people filling up my aisle up until the last media time out of the first half. People were coming in late, but ultimately it was a very full student section. I'd say the balconies were about half full, the main level almost completely full, and that was pretty indicative of the status of the whole gym. It wasn't for a lack of energy, but at the end of the day, you had a mostly full Assembly Hall cheering on the number 25 team, and while there were a lot of boos, deservedly so, early on, you still saw a crowd who, particularly in the beginning of the second half, did exactly what Indiana fans are supposed to do, and just really elevated the energy in the gym. You saw a corresponding elevation of the team's effort. They responded. What they couldn't do was sustain that response. I agree that this is not a team in full-on crisis mode, but I think you're astute to point out that this is a team that's perpetually on the brink. Or at least
it's not a program. It's not a team. It's a program. It's a program.
Yes,
but it doesn't need to be. That's my point.
Perhaps it doesn't need to be, but I think at the end of the day, too, when you recognize this is a team that very much had top third potential for the conference. We agreed on it earlier in the season. Most national analysts agreed on. It's a team that should be able to compete in the league, and you find yourself in a position where, having lost 2 in a row, hosting a team that statistically you're equal in the conference right now by most metrics, it should have been a whole lot more competitive than what it was. Recognizing just the steep hill that they have in the immediate future with the string of road games, with the trips to Mackey, with the trip to Breslin, and perhaps the number 1 team coming in home. Opportunity was in front of them, and again they fell short. Is it a crisis? No. Is it?
You're talking about this season.
Right.
I'm talking about a problem that I think you
could extrapolate this season further, though.
Around this program for 20 years, and I think it's important to maintain that perspective, because if you don't see the forest and you just get caught up in the trees, then you do start to see each of these individual setbacks as a crisis. But if you step back and you look at it and you say, listen, it's been 20 years and we have seen much worse. We have seen a fan base openly revolt on itself. We have seen NCAA sanctions. We have seen midnight firings. We have seen, just complete season meltdowns. What we're talking about right now is a young team with some undeniable strengths that are not being maximized and some problems that it may or may not have the capacity to fix in year 2 of a young head coach's tenure. That is absolutely cause for looking at things and saying what needs to change, what needs to get better, what does Archie Miller need to do better as he builds this roster more in an image that is completely under his control? What do his players need to improve? You know, are there maybe different points at which the mountain needs to meet Muhammad a little bit in terms of, you know, Archie and his style and his system and what he's willing to compromise and what he's not. But it's not a crisis, and you can't live in a world like it is not healthy for the program and frankly probably just for these fans in general to live in a world where every single loss is cause for some sort of program-wide inquisition into what's gone wrong and what needs to be fixed and who's at fault and how they should be punished.
No, I think that's fair. I think it's perfectly reasonable to acknowledge that it's been somewhat of a toxic fan base over the last 2 decades. I think at the end of the day, and this is one of the issues that plagues both the football and the basketball program when you talk about the program health, about the culture of the team, of the university. At the end of the day, one of the root issues is always going to be talent. And Sansi. It's one of those situations though where talent attracts talent. Teams that are playing with positive energy, and I don't even know where I'm. Teams that play better tend to attract more talent. Teams that play worse tend to repel talent. And when you look at what are the obstacles that Archie faces building this program going forward, not the least of which is he's going to have to compose a roster capable of winning on nights like last night, to be honest with you. He's not there yet. I don't know
of making Nebraska a banker of a win, and that's
I don't know that we're going to be there next year, because right now when you look in the backcourt, at least you're replacing Romeo Langford with Armand Franklin. You're losing Juwan Morgan, and while you've got Trace Jackson Davis coming in, there's a lot of other pieces that are up in the air right now, and until those balls fall, you don't know that there's going to be progress necessarily. And I think a lot of fans, while they may be overreacting in the minutia, also see the overarching picture here that if that doesn't change, these circumstances won't change anytime soon either. And I don't know that the overreaction helps in any way, shape, or form. I think it hurts. But at the end of the day, too, I think it also is acknowledging what's very much a reality for these programs, both. They got to get some better players in, and they need to do it fast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that I don't understand where this is coming from. I'm just saying that I don't think it is. I think this is a fan base that has got to find a way to throttle back a little bit and to recognize that its present is not nearly as fraught and on edge as its past. And I'll throw this back at you, and then I'll give you the last word if you want it, and then we need to cut this off just because we're nearing kind of our time limit here. You're right that there is a lot of reason to believe, at least on paper, that Indiana takes a step back next year, or at very least doesn't take many tangible steps forward because of what you're going to lose versus what you're going to bring in, because you're likely to be a young team again, and that sort of thing. But this is a statistic that I was debating with a friend of mine who's a diehard IU fan, and who I think I probably have sort of felt like I've been talking off the ledge a little bit in the last few days. Tom Izzo, first Final Four, year 4. Bill Self, first Final Four at Kansas. This is the program that made them, famous. First Final Four at Kansas, year 5. Mike Krzyzewski, first Final Four at Duke, year 6. So my point is, if I'm not mistaken, John Calipari, first Final Four at Kentucky, where it felt, just plug and play. If I'm not mistaken, first Final Four at Kentucky, year 4. My point is, even the best to have done this, the one kind of outlier is Roy Williams, who inherits, and Roy's a great coach, don't get me wrong, but he also inherits a very good situation from Larry Brown at Kansas, and then he inherits a very good situation from Matt Doherty at North Carolina. Even the best to do this took time. Mike Krzyzewski didn't hit the front from day one. It took him time to build his program in the way that he wanted. Same with Tom Izzo. Same even with Bill Self. And Self had some high-level success. He was winning the conference and things like that. But again, Self also inherited a pretty good situation from Roy Williams, and it took him 5 years to get it to a point where he went to a Final Four. And so what I'm saying is what are widely recognized as the best coaches in college basketball today needed this time. It's just easy to forget that now that they have put together the career resumes of Tom Izzo's been to X Final Fours and Mike Krzyzewski's won X national titles and Bill Self's won, 48 Big 12 titles in a row. It's easy to forget that even they needed time.
Tom Crean, first Final Four, year 4.
I mean, and I'm not. It's just the idea that like
greatness must percolate.
I mean, Archie's been on the job for 21 months.
Yeah. No, I think it's a perfectly valid point.
And this is where I get to circle back to the idea. This is not a crisis, and this fan base has to. And I don't know how. I don't have a solution for it. I'm that guy that's throwing the problem against the wall without any tangible solution. I acknowledge that. But this is a fan base that has to find a way to discern what is really a crisis and what is not.
I recommend Jameson, Irish whiskey. Copious amounts of that.
Only if you are legally old enough to drink.
Yes. And not driving anywhere, please.
Please drink responsibly.
No, honestly, though, I mean, we're 30% of the way through the Big Ten season right now. It's obviously going to ease up a little bit on the back half of it. There's still a lot of basketball yet to be played. I think right now, what I would recommend most folks do, what I'm trying to do myself personally, look for some incremental growth here. Look for the way in which they respond. Again, before we kind of went off on this historical overview and kind of the overarching picture, I look at Saturday as a tremendous opportunity. It's scary as hell in a lot of ways because it could get ugly really fast in Mackey if this team can't find its legs and quickly. But what a way to regain the confidence. That was one thing that Fish and Eric Sewer were talking about in the postgame show last night. You really got the sense that this was the type of a loss that can sap a lot of the team's confidence at a really inopportune time in the season. And while I tend to agree with that, I also look at Saturday's game at Mackey as a tremendous opportunity to regain it and then some perhaps with the win at Purdue. It's a team, I think, that in a lot of ways like Indiana, it's flawed, it's incomplete, it's not the unit that perhaps Painter wishes it were. And a lot of Purdue fans, for that matter, they have similarly been going through some periods of angst. Again, tremendous player in Carson Edwards could pose all sorts of matchup issues for IU, but I think IU poses all sorts of matchup issues for Purdue. Romeo's ability to get to the basket as well as Juwan's ability to grind it out. So I'd say at this point it's kind of wait and see. It could get apocalyptic real quick on Saturday afternoon, though, if the boys don't show up.
I'll drop this one last historical reference, and then we'll finish this off. 2012, year 4 for Tom Crean at Indiana. They start 15-1, and then they lose 3 in a row, and overall 5 of 7. And then the season turns with a trip to Purdue and a win at Purdue on February 4th, and they only lose 3 more times the rest of the way. Once to Iowa in the regular season, once to Wisconsin in the Big Ten tournament, and once to Kentucky in the NCAA tournament. And before anybody yells at me, their worst loss in that stretch was against Nebraska, away from home. Ken Palm number 152. So
true story. I was threatened with ejection from that game.
Well, that's a story for another podcast. Mostly because this one has gone on far too long. Thank you, as always, Chronic Hoosier, for joining the podcast. I shouldn't say joining, your co-host. Thank you all for listening. We are in your kitchen. It's a nice kitchen. My
wife has good
taste. We're not going to get into kitchen chat. That's not where this is going. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us for another week. We will be back next week to talk about Purdue and anywhere else that this season has taken us.
The Atlanta Thrashers.
For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. We'll see you soon.